tonight is a very special evening for us. We enter the second year of a program that began with a grant from the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago that's allowed us to bring major filmmakers and very prominent critics to town to talk about the art of film. Last year we had 4 such visits, and this year we have the honor of beginning our MacArthur dialogue with a fellow who won, back in 1985, one of the MacArthur Fellowships, the so-called Genius Awards, John Sayles. Since winning that in 1985, he's made some of his most ambitious films, including Matewan, City of Hope, which we'll be showing tomorrow night. He's published a new novel, received numerous awards for his work, worked in episodic television, and I hope he works in it again, and has agreed to come and talk a little bit about a very unique career in film. I want to just briefly, before we start, to thank 2 or 3 people who've made this evening and tomorrow night's program and a really wonderful retrospective possible. Maggie Renzi, John's longtime partner and producer of half of his films, and also a performer. You probably best know her if you've seen Secaucus 7 as Kate, the central character, but is also in, I think, 3 or 4 of the other films in fairly major roles. And Caroline Otis, who is on the Walker board, and together they helped put together this extraordinary evening and an evening tomorrow night with City of Hope. To dialogue with, to converse with John Sayles, we have from Boston, one of the really premier film critics. He's syndicated, though regrettably not very much in this market, Jay Carr. And Jay has spent quite a bit of time re-seeing and reviewing the work of John Sayles, and we're going to have a chance to see some of that work tonight that he's picked, and also hear both from Jay and John Sayles. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome now, for our first MacArthur Dialogue of the year, John Sayles and Jay Carr.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Well, you've all seen the facet of John Sayles that most of us film buffs don't know a lot about. We know he's a writer, we know he's a director, we know he's an actor, but here we have John Sayles, the maker of music videos. So suppose we start with John. You're just telling us what the circumstances were and how you got into the music video business.
Yeah, I've been in it only to dip my toe in, really, but when we were making Baby It's You, we had to contact Bruce Springsteen's management to ask if we could use some of his songs in the movie, in the soundtrack, since he's one of the few artists who still controls the rights to his own songs, and got him eventually to see it, and he liked the movie, and he said fine, and that was the first connection. And then through the writer Dave Marsh, who was got sent a dance tape that Maggie Renzi's sister Marta had made. We had another connection, and right when he was starting to realize that maybe he should make some rock videos because everybody else was, and I think his nieces and nephews were saying, come on, come on, come on, Def Leppard does it, why don't you? I got a call from him, and he said, well, I'm interested in having you work on Born in the USA, and all I can really tell you is, I think it should be gritty. And I said, well, I do gritty. And so that one, he was really just getting involved in it, and really had done the Dancing in the Dark one, and it felt uncomfortable lip syncing. And he said, well, here's the problem. I think I should be in it, and the band should be in it, singing the song, and maybe there's some other things that you can do. But I don't want to lip sync, but I also want to use the recorded version. I don't want to use the live version, which meant that what we had to do was rough sync it, which means that we at least got Bruce to wear the same clothes for 4 nights in a row. They did wash them in between. And we shot from as many different camera angles as we could on those 4 nights and hoped that they were on the same beat. And then you just try to find this much film where his lips are going along with the recorded version. which if you've ever seen the video, at sometimes he just backs off from the microphone, but his voice is still right up there, and it's pretty rough. But then we had a lot of documentary footage that we also were able to cut in it. It was mostly fun cutting it. Ernest Dickerson, who's been shooting Spike Lee's movies and who shot Brother from Another Planet, shot that one with me. And then after that, he was really felt like, oh, that turned out pretty good. And I think his nieces and nephews and people around him said, well, you got to do a story video where you're in it as a character, because people were starting to do that. And with both Glory Days and I'm on Fire, they were basically stories. The stories were kind of in the song already, or at least what the stories were about. And it's the only time I've really worked as a director doing somebody else's stories, because Bruce gave me, well, I have this idea and it's about a guy and he wanted to be a pitcher, but he got married instead, and so he's always regretted that, but he's also got this kid, and you know, he's married and he likes that. And so he's kind of torn both ways. And the same thing with I'm on Fire. He basically gave me the idea of the story, and then I would storyboard it and we'd shoot the pictures. The difficulty with that one, Glory Days, was that it was, I think, about a week or two after he had just gotten married. And so it was, you know, bigger than the Sean Penn Madonna wedding, and there were helicopters overhead looking for us, and the local radio stations were giving out bulletins that they'd just seen the caravan of the filmmakers on Route 3, and if you went to Route 3, you might see Bruce in the flesh. And so we had to do a lot of hiding on that one.
Well, in addition to directing for the first time someone else's story, because you've always directed your own, you've spoken before on the difference between film and video. There are aesthetic differences and other differences. How was the feel of this project for you? Did it feel any different in terms of what you did, or did you approach it exactly the same way?
Well, we shot on film and then transferred onto video to do the finaling of it. You know, we basically cut it on film, shot it very much like a film, and then transferred it to video. And I have this theory that may be, you know, kind of a sub-theory of Marshall McLuhan, that there really is a difference between television and video. Video and film, that, you know, there's some visceral difference between seeing, you know, light shine through these pieces of plastic that are being projected and seeing electron dots move. And there's certainly a difference between seeing something that was shot originally on video. We shot Born in the USA on 16 because when you blow it up, it gets gritty. And the other two, we wanted a little more clean look, and so we shot on 35. But basically, it was very much in a way like the editing that I did on Baby It's You, where we were cutting to Bruce Springsteen music. Except in this case, we were able to take songs that had stories in them much more, that wouldn't get in the way of the story that we were trying to tell, and try to do something with that. We didn't want to just illustrate what the words were saying, so you wanted a kind of story. You wanted to kind of make a small movie that this would be the perfect soundtrack for. And that's a funny kind of line to walk.
So you weren't entirely in a foreign country then, in terms of the aesthetic?
No, not at all. And also, it was just, there were stories I liked and music I liked, and it was a lot of fun to cut to great music.
And we know that we now owe the existence of these videos to Bruce's nieces and nephews.
Yeah, or somebody very close to him, under the age of 14.
Yeah. Well, that's the music video career of John Sayles, and we're now going to launch into the program proper, if proper is the word, by starting to show you the films, which will begin in chronological order, and which, if you haven't already made this observation, you soon will. Namely, that the films of John Sayles represent a body of work that exists in a social context. This automatically kind of makes him an outsider, because Hollywood's idea of a social context is Terminator 2. I mean, that's about as social as they usually get, and even that's a little heavy for many of them. But here's the social context. Not only is there a social context, there is within it the very strong desire to keep alive the idea of people finding ways to live in communities. This runs from the first film, Return of the Secaucus 7, to, as you will see, the last film, City of Hope. It's a constant. It's an ideal that's being kept alive during a decade when this ideal was not very much in demand. It was a very selfish, decade where American individualism, I think, showed in many respects the worst of itself. But yet, here's this ideal being kept alive in John Sayles' films, and being kept alive in a particular way. One of the things you'll see, and we'll discuss a little bit after you've seen the film clip from Secaucus 7, is that John Sayles, as a writer of films, as a writer of some utterly commercial films, is very familiar with film genres and with their demands and with, with the ways you do things within genres. Yet in many respects, and this is again something we'll discuss after a few clips, John bucked genres, and it was a very conscious, deliberate choice. Before we get into details on that, let's have the first film clip now from Return of the Secaucus 7. This is the film that launched John Sayles as a writer-director, and perhaps even as an actor, although you won't see him act in this film. You'll see him act in another one. Well, there are the Secaucus 7, who actually come from, in this picture, they come from New Hampshire. One of the things that impressed me, seeing it again, but from the first time I saw the picture, and you'll recognize that, there are a lot of pictures like this. A lot of pictures came after this, trying to deal with this territory, but this was the one that started it. How did you achieve this hanging out quality that these people were able to project? Even most of the hanging out, of course, goes on in the house of Mike, the guy in the white shirt. The plot briefly is these people, it's a few years after they all used to hang out together, and they've now come back to gather for a weekend in the house of Mike and Kate, played by Maggie Renzi, the one in the middle with the dark hair. They're back there now, and these are people who have been forced to make some practical decisions with their lives, to learn to come to terms with the world a bit, and yet obviously are trying to keep alive, the ideals that were a very strong part of their lives when they hung out together as a group. How did you preserve this hanging out quality that they were able to seem to slip right into? Well,
some of it was that about half the actors had worked together before and had worked in summer stock in the town that we were shooting this movie in. So we're used to each other, had been in youth theater groups together, had hung out together. The other half fairly quickly fell into it because we put everybody up in the same ski lodge, which was also our studio, our set, all of our sets. One of the reasons that there's very little camera movement in the movie is because if you move the camera 2 inches to one side or the other, you discover, in fact, you're not in somebody's living room or bedroom, you're in a ski lodge with enormous ceilings and, pictures of alpine people and Stein Erikson on the wall and everything. And so we shot in about a month, and people lived in the ski lodge. They helped carry sandbags around. They helped do the dishes sometimes. They got to know each other while we were shooting off with somebody else. They did hang out together. This scene is after a long, long night in a bar that they spend, and we didn't have a makeup person on this thing. In fact, there was no makeup in the movie, and we didn't have a costume person and all those kind of cost-effective things that, because we didn't have any money, we did without. Everybody brought their own clothes, and shortly after said, "Oh, I hate this thing I'm wearing." And I say, "Well, that's tough, because you're going to wear it for a third of the movie. We've established it now, and we can't reshoot." And in fact, we shot this probably about 3 in the morning. So that haggard look that they have was earned by staying up that long.
Did you go over, was any of this improvised, or was this all scripted, in fact?
There's actually one improvised syllable, one syllable that was different than the script in Secaucus 7. And it's a good illustration of some things. With a very, very low budget, it's very expensive to improvise.
The budget is probably the parenthetical place to insert the budget. What was the budget?
It was about $40,000 out of pocket to get it in the can, and then another $20,000 to get it through post-production. So it's also, as you noticed, it is a bit gritty. It was shot in 16 and blown up. We didn't know that it was going to be blown up at the time, which is why the frame line is like here on a lot of people. So we shot it for, this might get on PBS someday. We shot it in TV ratio, and then when you blow it up, all of a sudden the ceiling comes down and the floor comes up. We shot at about a 5 or 6 to 1 ratio. Which people in this country, that means for every foot of film that you actually use, you expose 5 or 6. A technical movie like The Terminator 2 probably is closer to 100 to 1 or maybe more. The only people who shoot tighter than that are Eastern Europeans who get a 4 to 1 ratio from the state. But since everybody is working for the state, they can rehearse for 3 days or for 3 weeks and then pull the trigger and do 2 takes and I'll go home. We were able to save a lot of money in that way. What was the original question?
I asked whether you improvised, and we
Oh,
segued
yeah.
into the budget, but
the improvisation
we were talking about the
is
ensemble
expensive.
quality, I think.
Yeah, improvisation is expensive because it may be lousy. In fact, it usually is lousy, and you have to cut away all the bad stuff to get to that one great improvised nugget. So it was very much what you read is what you say, except for there's a scene in this where the character Jeff, who said Bambicide in this, who's the one kind of dark undertone of the film. He's not doing very well. He's working as a drug counselor, and he's just broken up with his girlfriend Maura, who shows up a day before him. And originally in the script, you've heard him talked about, you know that he's a difficult guy. Maura has told everybody, oh, I broke up, it's finally over. I'm so relieved. And in fact, she sleeps with another one of her friends that night. And then all of a sudden, the next day, this guy shows up, and he meets this local garage mechanic who kind of knows them all. And he says, so, are you still with that Maura? And in the original screenplay, he said, well, that's what I came up here to find out. And, the actor, after we shot that, like a day after, said, I haven't shot any of my other stuff, and I haven't even shot any of my stuff that comes after that moment, but I think it will really help if I'm more, forceful about that. That seems such a wishy-washy issue. I think he really hasn't given up. And I said, you're right. I think everything that happens after will have a lot more edge if you haven't given up. So we took like a quarter of a day and went back to the same location and set up all our reflectors and our camera and got the other actor and shot over his shoulder. And the guy who played Jeff went, yes. And then we took everything down and of course we'd drawn a crowd of people who said, oh, that's how they make movies, huh? Yeah. I'm getting in that business.
Well, there you go. Well, I knew you couldn't have written the whole thing.
Right, exactly.
Did you discuss with them in the preparation how it was? One of the great things about the film, I think, is the way the changes in society are delineated in a way by the changes in the relationships, and yet it never seems forced. This one isn't a symbol of, yuppiedom. This one isn't a symbol of, superannuated hippiedom. And I mean, it's not done in a clumsy way, but it's done obviously with a great deal of thought, and with some very conscious choices to buck, in a way, what I was talking about earlier, bucking the genre expectations of this kind of get-together film. Tell me a little bit about the thought that went into that setup.
Well, a lot of what I do with actors on any movie is we don't do a whole lot of rehearsal. I never do rehearsal where we sit in a room like a play and we read the script and then we do it over again and we block it out and put tape marks on the floor. Basically, the only rehearsal of that sort you get is on the set while the lights are being set up. And it's half technical and half whatever. What I do, however, is make sure that those actors know who they are. And so I'll usually write them all. In this case, I wrote everybody a 2-page character description of who they are and who they are to the other people. Nobody was playing themselves in this movie because they were unknown actors. Everybody said, oh, we got great performances out of all these kind of amateurs and they're playing themselves and all that. Only the guy who had the last line in that scene, who in fact was a security guard at Eastern Mountain sporting goods store, which was the location we were using, their office, he's playing himself. He really does talk like that. But the other people were acting, and they were people that they knew of. They, may have been at some point in their life, but it wasn't who they were then. And so very careful, and I would talk to them about who you are, and this is your relationship to this person, and then this is what you want. So if you think of the typical Hollywood screenplay, there is an arc to it. In a cowboy movie, like Shane, you see the bad guy be bad to some nice guy and shoot him, and Shane sees it and he doesn't have a fight with him then, and then the arc eventually takes you, the arc of the violence eventually takes you to a shootout at the end. The arc of the emotional story eventually takes you to this young boy who's idolizing Shane, having a little respect for his father. Even in a non-action movie like Secaucus 7, I try to give each of the major characters an arc. So it might be the character that Maggie played, Katie, her arc was the first thing you see, she's really worried where everybody's going to sleep. She's the hostess, and she wants to get through the weekend without any major confrontations or bitterness or fighting, and have the whole thing work. And by the end of it, she does, and she's exhausted. Another character, the arc might be, I want to get my girlfriend back. Another might be, I want to get rid of this guy, you know, and it's sad and everything like that. But by the end of this weekend, I'm going to do this. So each of those characters have that arc. So in any one scene, they kind of know, okay, where does this fit into my personal thing? I have a function here, but I also have a personal agenda in this scene. And so even when you're just kind of sitting there bummed out, you have something to think about.
Are you often approached to come up with a sequel, to come up with Secaucus 7 too? Has there been talk of this?
No, not much, actually.
I mean, another decade's gone by, more changes that
Yeah.
they've had to assimilate. And,
Yeah, what was interesting is the couple times that I've had has been in interviews, and guys have said, so are you going to go back and make the Secaucus 7 at 40, you know, and call it 40-something or whatever? And I say, well, you know, there's not that much difference, except they have kids. And working with that many kid actors is like everybody's nightmare. And what's interesting is that the response is usually, but haven't they all now sold out and they all own this? And I say, no, that's The Big Chill, and that's why it was called The Big Chill. You know, because it's about different people. And the people in this movie and the people this movie is based on are people who are still consciously downwardly mobile. They're still spread out all over the map, but they still are in that mental state where they're trying to hold on to their ideals and implement them in some ways, and they now have kids. And that changes a lot of their lifestyle, but it hasn't changed them to say, oh, I have to get a safer job or whatever.
You can believe that some of these people would try and keep their ideals alive. For instance, if one were a doctor, you could believe that this guy would at least spend some time in a clinic taking care of poor people and maybe trying to fight the AMA to liberalize it.
Yeah.
You can believe that they have not all sold out, and they would not sell out without a real fight, even if they did.
Yeah, and I think that one of the differences people always ask me about The Big Chill and Secaucus 7 is that they actually came from different places. So one of the reasons I made Return of the Secaucus 7 is I kept reading articles in Time magazine, and this is fairly early. This is 1978 that I made this thing. Oh, isn't it great the 60s are over and all those old radicals and hippies are wearing three-piece suits and working for Chase Manhattan? And I didn't know any of those people. The people I knew were working in detox centers and teaching in inner city high schools and basically doing stuff that they weren't making much money at, but they thought was important to do and was satisfying in some way to them. So this movie in some ways was a reaction to that misconception. And I think when The Big Chill came out, there was this easy thing of, oh yeah, well this is Secaucus 7 with, you know, a bigger budget and nicer music, whereas it's called The Big Chill for a reason. It's about people who have lost their ideals or are discovering they never had them in the first place, and that's a very, very different group of people. Plus they dress better. And bring 4 changes of clothes to a funeral.
Yeah. Yeah, there was rather an indecent haste on the part of the media, including me, I guess, to bury people from the 60s, probably because they made them uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And this, you know, you see this a million times, which is another reason why this film stood out, because it not only didn't bury them, but made it clear that these people were really not quite ready to be buried yet, that in fact they were going to try and find ways to keep things alive as they proceeded into the world.
And you realize that the media is a double-edged thing, and so to a certain extent the media exaggerated and used hippies and demonstrators and radicals to, oh, this is copy, this is news, and those people ate it up because there was some political advantage in having it. But the other end of the story is when they're tired of you, they get rid of you in the most convenient way possible, which is to say you don't exist anymore.
Yeah. Well, we're going to do a little change of pace by showing you a clip from another movie that John Sayles did not direct but wrote. What you will see will be largely self-explanatory, so I'm not going to waste a lot of words telling you about it. We're going to switch right to a clip from Alligator, and then we'll have a few words to say about that. Yeah. Still one of my favorite party crashing scenes.
Yes,
I think.
when we were working on the movie in the story stage, Louis Teague and I referred to that as the Fall of Saigon scene.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the mid-'70s, there was this phenomenon, as you all know, called Jaws, which I thought was one of the great unconscious Vietnam movies. And, of course, right after Jaws, there then came along this movie called, because Roger Corman was working on a low budget, called Piranha. There were tiny teeth, but lots of them. And John Sayles wrote that. And Piranha was enough of a success that, from there it was just the merest leap of the imagination to Alligator. Well, tell us how you hooked up with Roger Corman and how all that worked, and then tell us also whether he minded the social context. And let me back up a step and just say the three of the victims you saw, they're even in a genre movie with a sort of Godzilla clone, this kind of Japanese monster tearing around the garden. There is a social context. This alligator became the monster it did because it got dropped into the sewer and fed on pollution, and the pollution was caused by a link-up, very explicitly defined in the film. The bald guy who's thought to seal himself in the car at the end is an industrialist. He's the capitalist who's financing this stuff, and he's in league with the Paul, who is the mayor, the guy banging on the window, and a scientist. So in other words, the capitalist has bought the politician and bought the scientist, and in the finest tradition of retribution, they pay for it at the end when what they spawn comes back to get them. This was the social context in the Roger Corman film. I always wondered if he minded a social context, if he thought that would sort of get in the way of what he was getting at. But back up a step and tell us how your involvement with Corman came about.
Well, I had actually just gotten out to the West Coast, and when people say, how did you start writing screenplays and how did you get an agent, I wrote 2 novels and a short story collection, and an agency out there was representing one of my novels as a film property, they called it, and I told them this doesn't need to be a movie. I don't want it to be a movie, but I'd like to write screenplays, and so they assigned an agent to me. And one day she called and said, I have a rewrite here of a movie for Roger Corman called Piranha, and you want it, you got it, and I took it. And I had actually gotten that job because Roger's right-hand person, Francis Dole, kind of did this reverse thing. If you remember being in class in high school and having a comic book inside your biology book, Frances is from Britain and she's very literate, and she used to stand in there reading lurid science fiction screenplays with real fiction inside, so she'd be reading like Edith Wharton or something, and just in case Roger peeked inside, she didn't want to get caught, and so she had actually read some of my short stories, and when my agent mentioned my name, she said, oh, that guy's a good writer, bring him over. And Roger always loves getting people who have a literary background or something, because he's going to pay him the same scale, and he figures he's getting a great deal. So I was one in a long line that includes Max Apple and Rita Mae Brown, who wrote Slumber Party Massacre. And so after writing Piranha, which did very well, I started doing other things for Roger. The deal with Alligator was another rewrite. And they, very much like Piranha was a rewrite, where they said, keep the title, get rid of everything else. So in the original Alligator script took place in Milwaukee, and the alligator had gotten big. It did live in the sewers, but it had gotten big from drinking runoff from the breweries. And I said, hey, the people in Milwaukee aren't that big. I mean, they have bellies, but they're not that big. And it all climaxed in the old abandoned sawmill, which a lot of things climax, which has been abandoned for 20 years, yet still has power. With the hero kind of fending it off with a chainsaw that somebody just left lying around there, and he chases it with this chainsaw that he's plugged in, that has the world's largest extension cord. So I decided I could do anything with this alligator I wanted to, and I decided that, like many social ills, that it would eat its way through the socioeconomic classes, that like most social ills, nobody would pay attention until it got to at least the upper middle class. So it really runs rampant through the city, and the media kind of starts talking about it, but until it goes for the poodle, the SWAT team doesn't come out. And in my version, in fact, there was some deal with an industrial military complex who were stealing puppies and little kittens and then doing medical experiments on them, and then had to get rid of the bodies, and they were throwing them down into the sewer, and Ramon, the alligator, ate them down there. If you notice the fast cutting in that sequence, the main problem with this giant alligator is that it's really slow and really bulky, and anybody at that party could have just said, hey, there's a big alligator there, let's walk away, and it might not bite us. So instead you have to cut really, really quickly and have people push each other in the pool like a Blake Edwards movie, and fall over each other, and cut to quick cuts of the tail knocking people in the air, and Louis Teague did a great job of making this very non-lethal. If you noticed in your flyers, the publicity picture of the alligator, if you look under his chin, there's a post there. They couldn't even take the post out from under his chin in the publicity picture. So this was not a highly mobile creature. And the other problem was killing him. Originally I was, I wanted him to be battling them in the water, and they said, the alligator isn't waterproof. It will sink if we put it in the water. So I said, oh, great, I'll just have it drown. And they said, no, that would be anticlimactic. And then I had them dousing it with a Molotov cocktail and it burning. And they said, no, we've booked it for a kind of personal appearance tour. And we only have one. It's now they sold it to like the University of Miami at, it's the Gators mascot or something like that. And they've mechanized it and everything. So eventually we had to blow it up, which is always good because you can just cut to an explosion. The usual Roger Corman method of dealing with anything, which is usually there was Joe Dante worked for them as an editor with Alan Arkish, and Roger they cut the trailers, the coming attraction trailers for the movies, and they had this one great shot of an exploding helicopter that had been in one of their Filipino movies, and he'd look at the trailer and he'd just say, I think we need the helicopter. And it was in like every New World trailer for about 5 years, whether it was in the movie or not.
Yeah. This is a problem that came up more than once, because in Piranha, all you really needed to do was not go in the river the Piranha were in, right? Well, how did they get around that?
Well, in the original Piranha script that I was given, the guy was obsessed with this idea that Piranha only attacked if there was blood in the water. And so people were constantly cutting themselves shaving and stubbing their toe, and oh, it's bleeding, And at one point, because he needed some mass deaths, he decided, the guy who wrote it hated hippies, and so he had a bunch of hippies around a fire doing obnoxious dragnet-like hippie things with a lot of bad dragnet hippie dialogue, and then they're attacked by a bear who mutilates them enough that they have to run into the river where the piranha eat them. And then the bear stumbles into the fire and catches fire and decides to go into the river to put out the fire, and he's eaten by the piranha. So I decided, okay, this is a little, heavy. And so basically, half of my work on that movie was contriving reasons for people to be in the water. In fact, not to know that there were carnivorous fish in the water. And that's difficult, and to keep the thread of the movie going. And then they solved it in the sequel, because at the end of Piranha, there was this question mark ending where, did they get to the sea? And these are the piranha that have been bred with some saltwater fish so that they can live in salt water. And in the sequel, Piranha 2, directed by James Cameron, a movie he never mentions when he mentions his career, starting with a Terminator, they had bred with flying fish. So that even up on a North Sea oil rig, they could still... Yeah. Anyway, the nicest thing about working on those movies as a writer is I wrote 3 movies right away for Roger, and all 3 got made, which is, 3 for 3 is incredible for somebody coming out to Hollywood, and even if you get paid for them, they develop so many things that they don't make. I got to go on the set of a couple of them and see them shot. And there wasn't a lot of pressure. The movie probably was in profit before they started shooting, because they'd sold all these territories off, and very often they were actually making it for half of the announced budget. And so there wasn't, you could have fun. You worked hard, and the people who worked on the movie got no sleep and didn't get paid very well, but you got to make a movie, and there wasn't that pressure of, oh my God, here's this guy's first movie, and it's going to cost $30 million, and if it fails, he will never work again, because everybody will say, oh, he's the guy who lost $30 million. You know, Alligator cost about $1.2 million, and probably about $400,000 of that went into the Alligator, which they had several versions of that kept falling apart.
It must have been useful as well to learn as a byproduct how to write stuff that would film cheaply. I mean, as an independent filmmaker, right? This is maybe the point to add that I think these days the average Hollywood film that you'll see at your multiplex costs something like $26 or $27 million to make. All John Sayles films put together haven't cost $26 million. In fact, they've cost a good measurably less than $26 million. So there's a way of learning how to set things up that will not cost a lot of money when you're producing your own film.
Yeah, with the action pictures, Roger always said, oh, don't worry about the budget. And then he'd pick some poor schmuck in the office and said, you're directing this thing. And I'd get a call from the director saying, you know, you've just written me a thing. You know how much money he gave me to shoot this? Lady in Red was set in Chicago in 1933, and Lewis, the same director, had to make it for $800,000. A period epic. You know, 140 pages of, you know, The Female Godfather for $800,000. And he said, you have 64 speaking parts in this thing. I have to pay these people. Can you combine some of them? And so on those pictures, I got to work with the directors a little on what can we do that won't cost a lot? What can this alligator do that we can do cheaply? Is night shooting going to be better? And you know, in Piranha, I had all these shots of the piranha eating animals, and Joe Dante, the director, just said, you know, animals are going to take me 15 takes before I can even get them in the water, you know, and they're going to scratch my handlers, and they're going to bite my nose, and get rid of the animals. We can't afford them. Get children, you know. They love that stuff. They love to scream, you know. They'll do take after take. Anyway, and with Secaucus 7, that's a movie where the budget came before the idea for the movie. I had $40,000 together from writing 3 movies for Roger. At that time, he was getting away with paying his writers as independent contractors, so he wasn't paying health benefits or welfare or, you know, any withholding or anything. So I had all the money in one place at one time, and I said, who in my, you know, extended family has ever had $40,000 in one place? I better make a movie with this. And I started thinking about what can I do well for this kind of money? What actors can be in this? Well, it can't be anybody in the Screen Actors Guild because you have to pay them a minimum. And who do I know who isn't in the Guild? Well, there's a lot of good actors who aren't in the Guild yet, but they're all the same age. They're all just about 30. Well, maybe that's what the movie will be about. And I started thinking about, geez, we can't move the camera. We're going to really not be able to afford an experienced crew. We're not going to be able to shoot it in all these different locations. What can we do where the movement can all be cutting? And I thought of Nashville, which had all these subplots. And I said, well, if you have 15 subplots, you can always cut to somebody. You don't have to pan, you don't have to track, you don't have to move at all to have some movement in the film. So it's going to be about a group of people turning 30. And I had worked in North Conway, New Hampshire, and I knew the theater, and I said, oh, there's a lot of woods there. We've got a set for free. New Hampshire, there's not even state taxes, you know, we don't have to pay any fees or anything like that. And so in some ways, the story evolved out of the limitations of the budget.
And now we know why there's no big car chase scene in Secaucus
Yes.
7. Exactly.
There was barely a car.
What we're going to cut to is another sort of science fiction film, but a very different one. And again, before we discuss it, let's show you the. This is an excerpt from Brother from Another Planet. I know the first time I saw that film, what I was struck by, even before I knew any more about this guy, just in this opening scene, was the wonderful convergence of resonances here. You've got, one of the most obvious levels, you see this guy, he's a bit of an E.T., he has this healing touch that he did to his own bleeding leg. There's also this wonderful resonance of the whole mythic American immigrant experience. but also shows you by his empathetic powers how he can pick up on all the feelings that fill that room being Ellis Island. And then also, as you'll see in a minute from the second clip, the Underground Railway residents. This guy is not just an immigrant, but he's also fleeing, a very bad situation in a previous life. I think I remember reading somewhere, or maybe you told me that at least one impulse of this came to you from a dream. Was that true?
Yeah, it was actually from a series of dreams that I had about the time that I was working on the sound mix of Baby It's You, which I made before this. I was under a lot of pressure, and I was often working late and getting 5 hours of sleep, and so you do a lot of dreaming and you remember your dreams a lot. And the first dream was that I had just gotten hired by Joe Dante, who had directed Piranha and The Howling, to do a quickie rewrite of a movie called Assholes from Outer Space. All I remember is the title treatment with that kind of 3D assholes from outer space. And they were like, normal human beings, except they had those little dealy bopper antennas, and they came down and they were bureaucrats. They worked at the motor vehicle department, and you had to deal with them, but they were assholes. And I woke up and it was like, oh, well, that's a skit. That's not a movie. And then I had a second dream that I was directing a very low-budget movie that was called Bigfoot in the City. And it was basically Odd Man Out, about this Bigfoot on the run in the city, and the streets were always wetted down. And the scene that I was directing was the one where the detective, the tough, but tender detective in his trench coat, walks down the rainy alleyway, and the Bigfoot is wounded and breathing hard, and there's fear in his eyes, and he's crouched in the corner, and the detective's kind of assistants come up behind him, and he turns to him and says, "Book him." And I woke up again, and it seemed more like a skit again. And then I had a very strange dream that was about a black man, and he was walking in a neighborhood that was all black people, and it looked familiar to me. And I realized the way that you realize in dreams, oh, I know why he seems so alienated and so worried. He's from another planet, and he can't talk. And even if he couldn't tell them that he's from another planet, because then they'd want to dissect him or whatever. How alienated can you get? And those three dreams kind of stayed in my head, and eventually this kind of, there was a synthesis of those with some of the, the science fiction comedy of the first one, and some of the kind of manhunt, odd man out of the second one, and then this basic idea of a runaway slave coming to modern day America and coming to Harlem and just trying to figure out what is the story here. How is this like whatever awful planet I came from, and how is it not? What has changed in some way. So in a way, he's somebody from the past as well as from outer space.
What the runaway also finds, again, is a sense of community in Harlem. He finds his community in a very loose, easy, but genuine and warm way from the inhabitants of a bar, just a routine neighborhood bar up in Harlem. And what he also encounters is a character played by John Sayles. After we see the next clip, The Bar in Harlem, a brief clip, we'll discuss a little bit with John some of the acting that he's done in his films. Where did you get that body language for that bounty hunter when he walks
Actually,
in?
what we did with that is there's a technique that you can do where if you turn the camera upside down and then do everything backwards, you can later flip the film like this, and it goes forwards, but it has a strangeness to it. So like if you just drop your hand, that looks natural, but if it comes up like that, which it does when you do that flip. So we had to work out all our moves forward and then remember them and then do them backwards. Originally I thought we could, with a tape recorder, learn our dialogue backwards too, and it would give it a nice thing, but the only thing we found we could say was "reep," which is beer. Would have been limiting to the dialogue. Yeah.
Where did you come up with those wonderful... one thing you didn't see, those of you who haven't seen the movie, there's a wonderful screech that these guys react with. Where did you come up with that screech? How did you arrive at that?
Well, we played around with a lot of sound effects. That was basically just us doing a kind of bat screech and then putting it through a harmonizer, which is one of these things that can change the pitch of a sound, in the sound studio without changing its length. So it's kind of like giving yourself helium and then screeching as high as you can. The sound that the brother uses earlier on to fix his knee is actually the sound of when you hit a chord on a piano and then put a microphone into the box of the piano and then cut off all the attack and just keep the decay of it and then turn that backwards. It made a great kind of weird sound. So we basically just played around with those things and until we found something that sounded right.
I think one of the things that you're seeing in terms of the ultra-economical approach of an independent filmmaker comes at the end when the two bounty hunters walk out the door and they walk into what looks like light from an atomic blast. Tell us about that brightness that
that's in cinematography that's called letting the outside burn out. And letting the outside burn out, there's various reasons you do it. If you remember the Martin Scorsese film Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, they let the outside burn out. It means that you don't balance the inside with the outside. You may put some kind of, if there's windows, you put these filters over the windows that you can't really see, but they knock down the light from the outside. It means that you don't have to use enormous lights inside. And it usually gives a hot, kind of nasty look to the outside. And in Scorsese's case, that was his reaction to the Southwest, where he'd never been before. In our case, it served two purposes. One was we didn't have to spend a lot of money balancing the light on the inside to the outside, and the other was we didn't have to art direct whatever was outside. There could be anything across the street. There could be a crowd of people across the street. There could be, in fact, as there probably was, several of our crew vans across the street, and the audience isn't going to see them because it's just going to burn out on you.
Well, the obvious reason for, assuming that you act roles in your own movies, aside from the part that you must enjoy it, at least in some respect, is that you save on a salary and you save having to give instructions to, that's one actor less you have to worry about. Is that, in fact, the case?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I was an actor before I was a writer, and it is fun, but when you're directing a movie and there's a lot of characters in it and there's a lot of locations and there's a lot of variables, every variable you can eliminate is like a relief. Oh, I don't have to worry about this actor. I've worked with him before. He'll take care of himself. Oh, I don't have to worry about this part. I'm playing it, and I know what I want to do with the thing. I always liken it to those guys who used to come on the Ed Sullivan Show and spin those plates on those things, and they have to run and make sure that one didn't smash. Well, if you can glue a couple of those plates down, you don't have to run as much. Also, now and then I felt like I know how to play this. In Leanna, there's a character that I played who's this kind of film teacher, and my only way to describe him to actors when I had people come in to read for it is, well, he's not a total asshole, but he's a partial asshole. And finally I realized that I knew how to play it, I didn't know how to direct it. I couldn't get the exact right mix from an actor because it was such a subtle thing, but hey, I could play it, and it was an easy part for me to play.
Yeah, some of the things you're going to be deprived of seeing are in Return of the Secaucus 7. John plays a townie, the guy who runs the gas station and knows all these people. And in fact has one very funny scene where he's sitting at a bar talking to the guy who's contemplating marriage, says, think long and hard, think long and hard. He plays a townie again in a clip from the film. We're going to see a clip from a film called Unnatural Causes. It's about a brave civil servant's fight to get the government to own up to what it did to its own troops with Agent Orange. You won't see John in this, but again, he plays a very straight role. Another townie. He's a guy who knew one of the guys who died from Agent Orange, and he's describing this dead buddy to the guy who's investigating the case. He's also played Was it fun playing Ring Lardner in the baseball film 8 Men Out?
Yeah, it was interesting. With Ring Lardner, I usually try to take characters just for practical reasons who are outside of the emotional loop of the other characters or actors. Partly because I know I'm going to be so busy directing that I'm not going to have the time to sit down with them as fellow actors and work out our shtick, work out our emotional background, or, oh yeah, we're supposed to be married 20 years, how do we walk when we walk into a room, all that stuff that I expect the actors to do with each other when they're playing characters who know each other. So I play people like these men in black who are not even from this earth, who are definitely out of it. Ring Lardner was a character who, although he admired the ball players, was a very kind of stiff, aloof kind of guy who was kind of always watching from the sidelines. And he was the perfect part for me to play, because also as I did more research about him, he was my age, and he was 6'2", which in 1919 was enormous, and I'm 6'4". And anybody looks tall next to Studs Terkel, but everybody talked about him looking like a giant next to his friend Hugh Fullerton, who Studs played. So there were some things that automatically said, oh, I should get a tall guy who doesn't have much emotional commitment with these guys to play it. And then it seemed like, oh, I can do this.
I wonder if Fullerton is not really known, so it didn't much matter how Studs Terkel, behaved. But people know, or think they sort of know, some people think they sort of know Ring Lardner because of his reputation. Were you intimidated at all by playing an actual character?
Not especially. I did my research as an actor, is what I did, which was read enough accounts of people like Fitzgerald or whoever who knew him to get an idea of the way he moved, his personality. He had a very, very dry sense of humor. He had dark moods. He was a drinker, but always went away from his family to do his drinking and not lay it on them. A very moral, caring person in this kind of gross jock world. And an anomaly in that way, but respected by the players because they felt like he was a fairly honest reporter.
Yeah, he was one of the few people outside of the players who were confused but not bad guys that you could respect. The unusual thing, I'll just say this because we're not going to see a clip from this film, there wasn't time to include everything, is that it was very unusual to see these 1919 Black Sox. First of all, is not anything archetypal. You realize these were kids, these were young men, just a few months or a few years off the farm or out of the factory. They didn't know very much. They were trying to behave in honorable ways, but they were also seen as members of an industrial society, and really on the low end of the on the low end of the order. And if there's a villain, it was just as much Charlie Comiskey, the owner, who would kind of grind them under his heel, as much as the obvious villains, which were of course the gamblers who fixed the World Series. I'm starting to stray. I'm starting to digress. I think what we're going to do now is get back to the clip from Unnatural Causes, the Agent Orange film. Again, John Sayles did not direct this, but he wrote it. And after the clip, we'll talk a little bit about working the two different sides of the street, and in fact, how different the sides of the street are. This is a TV movie shown in 1986, and Alfred Woodard is playing a woman who actually didn't exist. This was a woman who was practically the only one in the ironically entitled Veterans Benefit Department, who was actually trying to benefit these veterans who had been sprayed with Agent Orange and now several years later found themselves developing serious diseases and then dying. I'm sorry to say that the picture is still timely. I just read in the paper recently the government is still trying to weasel its way out of accepting responsibility for what happened to these men. Do you feel yourself doing anything differently as a writer when you're writing a film that someone else is directing, as opposed to a film that you'll be directing?
It really depends. In the case of this film, it was something where the producers came to me and said, we think it will help us get this movie made if you write it, whether it's name value or just we think you're the person to write it or whatever. I tend to always think about who is going to be reading this screenplay. And so even for some of my own screenplays, if we don't have the money in my pocket, which was the case with Brother from Another Planet and Secaucus 7, if I'm not the financier, we have to sell it to somebody first. So I tend to, in those screenplays, do a little more hype in the writing. There's a few more exclamation points. There's a little more description. There's a little more active description, some underlining, some capitals. It's kind of like writing the book and the jacket copy of the book in the same thing. When you know that a director is going to come and take it, if you don't know who that director is going to be yet, and in this one, I went through the first two drafts before Lamont Johnson was brought in to work on it. You really tend not to be casting your eye toward a director reading it, but in this case toward studio executives reading it, or for, if you're writing something like Alligator, for the people who are making Alligator to write it, whatever. Those are the people you have to sell first. So you may have your own agenda and your own things that you want to do, but you've already asked them, what is it about this story that you like? What is it about this story that excites you? And you make sure you address those things that they like and that excite them. The other thing, in television, a TV movie, the structure is very different. A TV movie is basically 7 acts because of the commercial breaks, and you try to time those in the case of a TV movie, so that they don't come on the half hour or the hour, because then people can click to something else and, see the coming attractions for the next show. So to a certain extent, that's a problem, and just as you're rolling, there's going to be this commercial, but you can also use it to your advantage. And what I often try to do is, whenever there's going to be a time transition, which in a feature you have to do with a dissolve or a montage or a superimposed thing that says "came the dawn" or 7 years later, you just line it up so it comes just before the commercial. And hey, after 6 commercials, time has in fact passed. You come back from the Charmin commercial, and it's 6 years later.
Has there ever been a time you started as a writer, pretty quickly got into film writing and then filmmaking? Has there ever been a time where you've considered yourself primarily a writer, who makes films, or maybe subsequently thought of yourself as primarily a director who writes films? Or are you just bi-coastal? You just shuttle back and forth naturally?
Yeah, I think what's happened with me is I consider myself a storyteller, and the fiction that I write and the movies that I write and direct are my stories. And then what I do for a living, how I make money and pay the rent, is to write things for other people. And there, you're an employee who's helping them tell their story. The only movie that has ever been made that came from a speculative movie that I wrote is Breaking In, and that I sat on for 8 years until the right director came along. The rest of them have all been assignments, have all been rewrites, or here's a story, will you write this? Here's a news article, will you write this? And this is our story, and will you help us tell it? So you're much more of a technician in those cases.
Do you find the mechanics of one sometimes leak into the other or get in the way? I remember you saying, for instance, that as a director, you're frustrated, but in ways that you wouldn't be as a writer. An example being that if you're a writer, you don't have to worry if the sun isn't shining that day, or you can just describe anything you like. Do those mechanics ever bleed over on you?
I think they don't. I think that I'm so aware of the practical part of making movies that it's almost automatic when I write something, somebody's got to shoot this. I've had directors, I wrote a thing for John Frankenheimer where at one point he read a 20-page sequence and he just said, "Kid, you shoot this stuff." I've got to get this picture in on budget, and then we had a conversation about how to get it in on budget. When I wrote Battle Beyond the Stars for Corman, one of his ideas was, and he had liked some science fiction book where it was a planet with 2 suns. And that lasted through the treatment stage and everything. And I said, "So Roger, this thing about the 2 suns, is this just something you like?" And he said, "Yeah, I really think it would be an interesting visual idea to look up in the sky and there's these 2 suns." And I said to him, "If you have 2 suns, you have 2 shadows." And he thought for a minute and he said, "That would cost a lot of money, wouldn't it? That's really hard to light. 1 sun,
One of the things you should know about several of the projects that John Sayles has brought about is that he's not afraid to take his time and to get them done right. Los Gusanos, the novel he just published about Cuban exiles living in Miami, took 13 years. The first film, probably I think the 6th film John made was 8 Men Out, but in fact that was the first one he did.
I wrote the first draft of it 11 years before we got to make it.
And you wrote at some point about right money and wrong money attaching themselves to film productions. And obviously one of the reasons it took so long is to wait for the right kind of money. But and by that I take it that's synonymous with non-interference.
Yeah, or else it's, in the case of 8 Men Out, it was a case of, Robert Frost's line about good fences make good neighbors. It was a combination of the right studio, the right money, and the right contract, so that both parties felt like they trusted each other, and that, for instance, Orion, who eventually was the studio that financed 8 Men Out, had passed on the exact same script, the exact same director, and the exact same producers 2 or 3 times before. And Orion didn't, it was the same people in all those years. It was the same people passing on it. And they always said, "This is an interesting story, and we don't think you can make it for the price you're telling us, and we don't think we can make any money. We'd love to see the movie, but we'd lose our shirts." Finally, there came a point. I had made 3 movies in the interim. Sarah Pillsbury and Mitch Sanford, the producers, had produced Desperately Seeking Susan for Orion and made money for them. They had seen Matewan and saw that we made it for $3.6 million, and it was an epic, and in fact it looked like one. So I think they believed that we could bring the movie in for the price we were saying, and there were all these boys hanging around. There was all these young male semi-stars, and everybody was trying to say, well, how do we get a bunch of these guys in the same movie? Well, you know, there's Army movies, so we can have Platoon or Top Gun, and how about sports teams? You know, there's a lot of guys in those things. And so part of the conversation that led to the movie finally getting made was, well, you know, who do you think would be in this movie? And I said, well, I want to control the casting. Well, we know you want to, but who could be in this movie? And so Sarah, Midge, and I wrote up our list of actors that we'd like to see in it, some of whom were known and some of whom weren't, and they wrote up their list of people they'd like to see in it, all of whom were known and were, you know, either big stars at the moment or almost stars or whatever. And in fact, there were 7 or 8 guys on both lists. So they said, okay, if you get 3 of these guys, you got to go project. And so we started talking to our favorite guys, and you know, we had some people turn down the parts because they said, I can't play that position, not I can't act that part. And you know, men are so vain about their athletic skills that they know I'm not being in a movie where I'm going to look like a schlub at third base. So you know, I offered John Cusack a part, and I think I offered him shortstop or second base, and he said, you know, I can't turn the double play. I have to turn this down. And then things shifted around. I said, well, would you like to play the third baseman? And he said, oh, I can play third base, sure. And it was a better part. So I think that was a situation where finally the time had come when they felt we were ready. They had enough of what they call elements to counteract the fact that, unlike The Natural, we couldn't tack a happy ending on this thing. We couldn't have the Black Sox win the World Series and you know, go, we're number 1 and do a freeze frame at the end of it. So they felt somewhat protected. The movie hasn't made any money, so they weren't protected, but they at least felt like they had a good chance of making their money back. And that may, you know, I've seen too many filmmakers just get so desperate that they sign up for the wrong money, and they end up turning gray in like 6 months and end up with a movie that they wouldn't even see if they hadn't made it.
I'll just say one more thing about 8 Men Out, a movie we're not going to see, before we pass to Matewan, a movie we will. And it illustrates, again, the resourcefulness of the independent, which is synonymous with low-budget filmmaker. Because Comiskey Park didn't look right anymore, they had to film this. They filmed it in a park in Indianapolis, which immediately, there were 2 problems. One was the park had lights. So that meant that they had to very carefully interpose the body of somebody, a manager, a coach, between whatever they were shooting and where a light stand would be. The other thing was, this was a World Series game, popular game, right? The stands would always be filled, but John couldn't afford 25,000 extras. So we had to make do with about 1,000 extras, but position them always so that the camera you'd always see a full frame full of people, but this meant moving these people around, you know, to different plays, which is another, you know, example of great field marshalry in the terms of making movies.
If you have very quick eyes, there are some cardboard cutouts of our location manager scattered in there. The real problem was that most of the people who have time free in the day are, you know, senior citizens, and to keep them entertained in between takes, we had bingo games going on with prizes. And it was time to move them. Of course, they didn't want to interrupt the bingo game, and being senior citizens, they weren't the fastest movers in the world. So we always had an alternate shot that we could go shoot while they were moving the senior citizens from right field to center field.
Well, we're speaking of movies that had a long gestation period. Matewan certainly is one. This is John's movie about the launching of the great coalfield wars in West Virginia and Kentucky in 1920, in the early 1920s. This, again, a movie with a gestation period of some years, actually many years, if you count the fact that it began in the union activist background, you know, that John has, and also in the fact that John met coal miners when, as a younger man, he was hitchhiking and was struck by them and by the stories they had to tell. Let's start out by looking at the film, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. I'm really sorry there isn't time to show you more from this film, which, although made for a few $1 million and describing a very bleak time in a very bleak environment, was told with just incredible visual richness. It's a wonderfully, almost a painterly looking film. It would be presumptuous of me, which is why I didn't before the thing started, to tell you what you were about to see, since these clips all speak very well for themselves. I might just add the detail that what you saw obviously was a coal miners' strike being joined by two groups that the coal company brought into scab. The two groups being blacks from the South, led by James Earl Jones, and Italian immigrants led by Joe Grafassi. They, of course, see what's going on, quickly size up the situation, and decide to throw in with the strikers. That's that very dramatic and, in a way, climactic moment. Could you tell us a little bit, John, about the genesis of the desire to make this film, arising from your conversations with coal miners that you had when you were younger?
Yeah, in the late '60s and early '70s, I hitched around the country, and one of the times I went through, actually a couple times I went through, I hitched through West Virginia and Kentucky, and there's not a whole lot of straight roads in either of those states, so it takes a lot of rides to get across the state. And a lot of the guys who picked me up were coal miners or people whose family were in coal mining, or fathers, husbands, brothers were in coal mining. And at the time, the big fight in the UMW was happening between Jock Yablonsky and the Miners for a Democratic Union and Tony Boyle, who was running the UMW, which kind of ended with Tony Boyle having Jock Yablonsky and his wife and daughter murdered. And that hadn't happened yet. And there was a lot of pro and con from these guys who would pick me up. And while people are getting serious and they're talking about guns and there's an ugly mood and it's awful when we have this kind of contention within our own union. And they'd almost always end up by saying, but this is nothing compared to the coal wars. And you should talk to my daddy or my granddaddy about the coal wars. And I'd never heard of these things. And so I asked them more about them. And the period right after the Matewan massacre, which is the end of the movie Matewan, there was in West Virginia the largest armed uprising in America since the Civil War. Thousands and thousands of coal miners in protest against their murder, basically, at the hand of the people working for the coal companies, commandeered trains, marched in formation, because many had been in World War I, armed on this one county in West Virginia, and had a 3-day pitched battle with the people who were hired by the coal company to protect their property. Billy Mitchell, the father of the American Air Force, said to the governor, look, I've got this great idea. You know those planes that just shot each other in World War I? We can drop bombs from those on people. Can I try it? And he said, sure, go ahead. So he was dropping bombs on miners. This was a major thing, and it was blank in my history banks. I had never heard of this stuff. And I felt like, well, this is American history that needs to be told. And it was a time when I was writing it, and a time that continued as I was making it, when people were questioning even the need for unions. And I was interested in going back to some of those turning points in the union movement of, number one, why unions were necessary, but number two, some of the questions that have dogged them ever since. If you, in fact, stop short of what Joe Kennehan, the organizer, wanted, which was worker control of the factories, what do you then have? And does that have contradictions which are eventually going to scuttle your union? All that, as I did my research, seemed to center in this one incident that seemed perfect for a movie, in that it seemed a metaphor for the whole period and the whole situation, which was the Matewan massacre. And I kept hearing the Matewan massacre. And as I read it, I realized, my God, we have a gunfight movie here. We have a story that ends with armed men walking down a street, looking at each other. That's something that, just visually and in the kind of, movie memory that everybody carries with them, has some very kind of classic reverberations. This is something that can be entertaining, that people will say, oh, this is a movie, but it's not a Western. But it, in fact, is in between genres. And this is the perfect kind of, thing that I can get into, where I can get people hooked on the story, but then leave them asking questions and feeling like they've been exposed to something they didn't know before.
Absolutely flies in the face of the genre, because the union leader, Joe, is a pacifist and he's the one guy who won't pick up a gun.
Yeah, I mean, the usual, Hollywood story conference would be, well, look, we've got to have this movie go over the top. Where's the point where he says, oh, gee, I used to be a pretty good shot, and, a man's got to do what a man's got to do, and he comes out and he blows away the bad guys. And I said, he is a pacifist. When we first showed this to studios, we had one executive say, I like the story kind of, but isn't the character kind of almost like a socialist? And I said, no, he's a member. He has a card. He's not kind of like anything. He's a wobbly, and he's to the left of the socialist. And he's, oh, okay. What else are you working on?
Well, we spoke, or rather, John earlier spoke of breaking in, which, as you'll soon see, represents quite a change of pace. John wrote this, as he said, waited several years for the right director, and we'll discuss that briefly after we see this clip from it. John, where'd you learn so much about thievery and the fine points and the ins and outs?
Well, it was an interesting movie in that I had written it. Was one of the second or third scripts that I wrote when I was first in Hollywood. About the same time I was writing Return of the Secaucus 7 and Leanna. And it was because my agent said, you've written this kind of lesbian movie, and you've written this West Virginia coal miner leftist movie, and you've written this thing about the 1919 Black Sox scandal. Can't you write something that's kind of cheap and contemporary, so when people call and ask for a sample of your work, you could possibly get some. So I started thinking about what would I write, and this idea had actually been a failed short story of mine, a short story that I rewrote in about 3 or 4 different voices, and it just never worked. I never got the voice right. I never got the story right. And I said, that would be great as a movie, or at least the beginning of a movie, and then where else can we go with it? And so I wrote this thing, and I got a couple meetings, as they say, off of it. And right in the middle of the meeting, I realized in 2 cases, I really don't like these people, and I don't want them to make this movie. And so I torpedoed the meeting kind of fairly quickly by just, disagreeing with them enough, which doesn't take long in a meeting like that. And nothing ever happened with it. And the producer, Harry Geddes, had read it and liked it, and every couple of years would say, can I take an option on this? And I said, well, if you take an option, then you're going to get a director, and if I don't like the director, it's not going to turn into something that I like. And finally he got serious and said, okay, you draw up a list of directors and I'll draw up a list, and we were about to do that. And he said, well, what about Bill Forsyth? And I said, call him, fine with me, great, get him. And a day later, Bill happened to need to do a movie in the States, and he really liked the material, and we were in business.
Was there, in fact, more than the usual hired gun situation here? Did you actually work with Forsyth or consult with him before the shoot or anything? Yeah,
this was one of those situations I've been in more than once, where there was about to be a Writers Guild of America strike. It was scheduled to start a week after Bill said, let's do this. So he came over the next day, we had a meeting, and I said, Bill, here's the deal, I'll do a 1-week rewrite of this, and then go make it a Bill Forsyth movie. And he's a good writer, and he's a good director, and he got the material. And usually when you have things that you wrote and other people direct, they're going to drop lines, they're going to drop scenes, and you just hope that the overall, gestalt of the whole thing is what you intended it to be. And what you really cringe, though, is when actors or directors or whoever make up lines and you're going to take the rap for them. And the great test of this is that Bill actually made up a lot of stuff, usually marginal stuff or little lines, or, only, Bill would have the guy take a bite of an onion when he opened the refrigerator. And I liked all of the stuff that, he added. And I'm happy to take credit for it as the writer.
Well, some of the credit was dished out by Burt Reynolds, who credits it with sort of resurrecting his career and enabling him to become an actor who, momentarily at least, is being taken seriously after a long string of attempts that flopped at that. And the youngster, the guy. This is as is pretty obvious to you. What this is it's a sort of sweet, quirky story about a father-son relationship, where the old burglar kind of takes the young burglar under his wing and wises him up a bit and straightens him out a bit.
Yeah, the movie is called Breaking In, and my main metaphor, which actually happens in the movie, was what happens if you hit a hole in one and nobody's there. And there's this guy who's a safecracker who basically, in order to stay out of jail, has realized nobody gets caught on the scene of the crime. They get caught because they brag about it to their friends, and then one of their friends gets arrested doing something stupid, and to get their sentence lowered, they turn in a lot of their friends, and there you are. And so he stopped having friends. But there he is doing this, what he considers an art, and he's got nobody to pass it on to, nobody to show off to. And then there's this kid who basically is loose in society, has no friends, and needs to break into society somehow. And the society that he discovers that will allow him to come in is this kind of criminal society.
Did the underground part of it appeal to Forsyth in your talks with him? Was that stressed or just kind of mutually assumed?
I think we really talked about both the plot and the under thing, and then Bill added his own things. Bill's fascinated with criminals. A lot of his movies have had to do with kind of inept criminals and what keeps them going, and the fact that there is this feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself.
Well, these guys are not inept. In fact, they're pretty clever and pretty competent. How did you find out? Did you just dream this up, or did you actually talk to criminals? How did you get the particulars of some of these jobs they did?
Kind of a combination of book research and talking to a couple guys who at least claim to have been, because the guys are all liars too, claim jobs that they didn't do and don't claim jobs that they did do. A couple people who actually, said that they had burned some safes. And the one line that got me interested in it before I wrote the short story that didn't work was a guy saying, "Hey, I'm an old guy. I can only crack old safes." That technology is always catching up with criminals, so that Bonnie and Clyde and Dillinger could exist because they could afford Hudson Terraplanes, and the cops had Model Ts. And they didn't have radio yet, and they didn't have the FBI yet and everything. But the minute they got that, the criminals had to up the ante with better. If you saw the movie Thief that Michael Mann made, that was the modern day burning bar kind of safecracker who has all this high-tech stuff. This is a guy who still blows them up, and there's only certain safes that works on, and they're old safes. And if a place has a new safe, it's not worth your bother doing it. So he ends up going to what he calls O Canada, where they still have a lot of old safes.
I knew there was a nostalgic element in that film that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The next film we're going to see. In fact, the last one is John Sayles' new film, City of Hope. It has not yet gone into general commercial release. It's played at a few festivals. I'm going to, at great cost to my own inclinations, restrain myself in remarking about it because it's going to be shown tomorrow, and you're going to be given a much more detailed discussion of it by John and by Maggie Renzi. Maggie is the producer of, in most cases, of John's films, and of course, that reminds me of the remark that another producer once made to me, to the effect that movies are not produced; they're willed into being. So you see Maggie in many roles on screen in John's films, and when you do, you have to realize that's the easy part of the role she plays in these films, playing the roles. The tough part is hanging in there, sometimes for a matter of years, till you get everything lined up that you need to get lined up in order to make a film. City of Hope is quite a film. It's occurred to me in recent films, John has been working on a much broader canvas, and this is a film. After I saw it, it's a bunch of parallel stories that show you what city life has come to, and how various kinds of corruption coexist. And what occurred to me is that John is working on broader canvases in Matewan and 8 Men Out, and now in this. And he spoke in making the return of the Secaucus 7 of how, the technical limitations, you had to cut from one to another. this is the only technical remark I'll lay on you, is that watch these wonderful prowling tracking shots and the way John braids the stories and braids the characters' lives together, as in fact they are braided together in this community. The community being a sort of apocryphal Hoboken, which is where John lives and works. It's called Hudson City in the film. In fact, it was actually filmed in Cincinnati. We'll discuss a few of these things briefly after the clip, and then you've all been very patient and long-suffering, and then we'll throw this thing open to questions from you. So now we'll show the clip from City of Hope. Minneapolis is a clean city, and the cities I've lived in are not so clean. And I know I watched this film and said to myself, yeah, this is pretty much the way, in my experience, cities work. Why don't I see this more often in the movies? You know, why don't I see this reflected? And here's a film that braids the stuff and links the stuff and links the stories in very rich, almost musical ways. Whatever the visual term for a musical experience would be, this film embodies it. It's like a score. You know, here the strings come in. Now they give way. Here's this oboe solo coming, and you can see all the different strands on like a conductor's score. You know, that has all the instrumentations written in. I notice also that there's another kind of culmination here in that John works with actors that he's worked with in many other films. You only saw the brief films here, so you didn't see people like Vincent Spano and Kevin Tighe, Joe Grafasi. I found myself wondering while I was watching this film, obviously the upside would be obvious that, you know, that you've worked with these people before and have a shorthand. Is there ever a downside in that these people bring to the new roles what they thought you liked in the old roles, you know, and you have to kind of get past that? Does that ever happen?
I don't think so. Usually what happens is very much like in a repertory theater. They say, well, I've played the fool, now can I play Othello? You know, actors, just like directors and writers, get typecast so easily, especially in films, that generally by the time we get around to making another movie, they've played 6 versions of what they played in their last one, usually in more expensive films. So Kevin Tighe, who was one of the main guys in Matewan, all of a sudden got offered 6 bad guys, and he played 2 of them, and then he said, well, I better play a good guy, or somebody very different than these characters, or else I'm going to get stuck in this bag. The only difficult part is when we make a movie is all our actor friends calling and saying, so is there anything for me? You know, it's like, you know, and now and then it's something like, you know, 8 Men Out, where, you know, there were, you know, 50 male parts and 5 female parts, and they were very small, and you just have to tell all of your actors friends, well, maybe next picture.
How many speaking parts are there in this? This is not a small cast.
There's 50 or 60, you know. There's probably about 30 characters who you should be able to say, oh, that's the guy who, and this is who he's related to, and this is what he does in it.
How generic is this picture in terms of cities, and how closely is it tied to your experience of Hoboken?
Well, it's actually, I've lived in a lot of different cities. I've lived in, I grew up and was raised around Schenectady, New York, which is a big General Electric factory town. I've lived in Albany, New York, which had, you know, the longest running Democratic machine, longer than the Hague machine in Jersey City, or the Daily machine in Chicago. I've lived in Atlanta, Georgia. I've lived in East Boston, Massachusetts, during the Kevin White machine. This is a composite of all those places, and one of the things that sparked my interest in making this movie is here I am in all these different places with these different ethnic groups making up the city, and yet there's something very, very similar about this patronage politics and the way that power either shakes down to the people or doesn't shake down to the people.
But in a sense, although this is a very contemporary setting, this is kind of a sour, rotting version of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, you get a sense that this thing is just about to break up. This is maybe like the month before the whole thing collapses.
Yeah, it's what I call the Tammany Hall period, and I think in this country there's a tradition of cities being ruled by one ethnic group or power group, and then eventually their group does well enough that they can afford to move to the suburbs, and there comes that short period when they're still in power because they can manipulate the vote or whatever, but they don't have the numbers anymore. And that's when patronage turns its most ugly, because they're not handing things out to anybody anymore, they're just stuffing it in their pockets. And in that Tammany Hall period, very much like what happened when Jimmy Walker was in New York before Fiorello LaGuardia came in, it's just people in power stealing everything that's not nailed down, and the people who are in the city not getting anything from them.
Yeah, there's kind of a feeling, isn't there, of the Irish and Italian blocks running on past momentum, the blacks beginning to become seated, you know, in the corridors of power, and in a more distant way, the Hispanics starting to push at it, make the push to get it.
Yeah, and it's not often a graceful transition. This is a small city, and in a small city, things are very, very concentrated. You know, in this movie, there is a chain from somebody at the top and their greed eventually, and not in a very circuitous route, leading to some people being killed. That chain may exist in every city. You may be able to make those links. It's just that in a small city, in a compressed environment like this city, the dots are closer together, and so it's not so hard to connect them. In a much larger city where everybody feels like, oh, that's happening way over on the west side of town, and who knows what those people do, it's easier to say, oh, you know, this isn't connected with, you know, real estate development. That doesn't cause any problems for anybody.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a time, you know, remember you heard it here, you're going to see some PhD paper written on the parallels between Alligator and City of Hope, you know, with the in terms of what's happening with the social structure and what's leaking down in a very obnoxious way from the top.
At one point, I had this poor kid who was in film school who was interviewing me for a real academic film magazine, convinced that Piranha was, in fact, an allegory for the Cultural Revolution in China. And as I told it to him, it started making sense. It was amazing.
Well, we don't need much to run with, John. You know, just give us the smallest brain.
The people who run studios, you know, you could eat babies and live, and if it made money, if people wanted to go see it, some of them would put those things out. Really, the politics may be why they don't want to make it in the first place, but if they think this movie is going to make money, they don't care if, you know, the International is the theme song and that it, all half the proceeds have to go to, you know, Saddam Hussein. You know, they're in the business of, you know, putting people in movie theaters. So it really is more, you're competing with people who, if they spend, you know, $40 million on a movie and another 20 on the advertising, and they borrowed that money, so once they pay the interest, they're talking about $75 million. They can't afford competition. They certainly can't afford competition from some squirt who makes a movie for $3 million and didn't even go through their system. And so they have to assure somehow that they get those 16 screens, and so you're left with a one that's not a multiplex. I mean, it's just kind of hard economic reality.
On that characteristic uphill note, I think we're obliged to end this.
Thanks a lot.